So today we are talking about writing a book series. And I would love to start just by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about the book series that we'll be talking about today. And I can start with you, Tracy, just so that our audience has a little bit of a better idea of where you're coming from.
Okay, I was all prepared for you to start with Kathleen. Okay, my name is Tracy Wolff, and I am currently in the middle, or I guess 2/3 of the way done, with writing the Crave young adult vampire series. The basis of the story is it starts as a fish out of water story. A young girl whose parents have died in a horrific car accident ends up having to move in with her uncle, who is her new guardian, and her cousin. Her uncle happens to run a boarding school in Alaska, which for this girl from San Diego is an entirely different world. And once she gets to the boarding school, she starts realizing that things aren't really quite what she thought they would be. And things are, one, it's a Gothic castle in the middle of Alaska that doesn't really show up on Google. And two, everybody there just seems a little odd. And then she starts to find out that the boy that gives her all the trouble happens to be a vampire, and her cousin is a witch, and her father at one point was a witch before he was stripped of his powers, and a lot of other things happen. And that's the basis of the story. And then we've carried it through Grace kind of finding her own footing in this world that she lives in, and getting to really explore the world, and a lot of really cool and terrifying things that happen in the world.
Thank you, Tracy. Kathleen.
I was fascinated to hear Tracy talking about witches and vampires, because my first standalone historical fiction book was The Heretic's Daughter, about my 9 times great grandmother, Martha Carey, who was hanged as a witch in Salem in 1692. So that kind of, the research on that was something that was really close to my heart. And I had written 3 standalone novels. And I wrote a short story for Dallas Noir. It was crime, which I love reading contemporary crime, but I'd never put my hand to it until I got the request from the editor. And I developed the story about this very strong transplant from New York. She is a detective, a narcotics detective with the Dallas Police Department. And I thought it was a one-off. I thought it was just going to be, one story, one and done. But the publisher thought that it was really unique, that the character of Betty Rizek was different. It filled a niche that you don't usually correlate with the noir crime, which was Chicago, LA, New York. So I developed it in Dallas and started, the first book was The Dime, and I wasn't sure it was going to be a series then, but it developed into a 3-book series after that.
Great, thank you so much.
It's really fun. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's really fun to play with paradigms like that, right? I know that people had said that my audio was a little off, so I'm going to try and speak a little louder. I raised my volume, and hopefully that will solve the problem. But yeah, I did an urban fantasy series set in Austin, which was also kind of a weird place several years ago to set one. And I had a lot of fun doing that too. And really, it's fun to play with new places, right?
Yeah.
Places that readers aren't used to seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's so cool. I love that.
They're great books. So just to start the rest of this conversation, I do want to start at the very beginning. And so I'm wondering, when in the process did you know that you were writing a series? And this is a 2-part question. So when did you know? And also, what about the story made you want to keep going? So for the writers out there who have this story and they're not sure whether they want to turn it into a series or if it's a standalone book, like what might they look for? And I can start with you, Tracy.
Okay. I think, well, there's 2 different ways to write series, right? Sometimes you write a standalone book and it becomes a big hit, and your editor and your publisher and you are like super excited and you want to keep the series going. And then you kind of have to really reimagine what it's going to look like at that point, and how do you build a series out of these characters and that kind of a thing. That is actually not something I have experience with. Every series I've written has kind of been planned as a series from the beginning. And the Crave series was certainly no different. We actually, it was a little weird. I know one of the other questions is about like the journey to publication and all of that. And I have, like I said, I've got a lot of books, so I have a lot of different publication journey stories regarding series, but the Crave series was different because my editor, actually, I had worked with my publishing house before, and they came to me and said, hey, we want to bring vampires back. Are you interested in writing a vampire series? And I was like, sign me up. I am dying to write a vampire series. And so we went in thinking it was going to be a trilogy. That's what we had always planned on. And the way we'd originally structured it, building the arc for the character, building the arc for the love interest, and the action arc, right, of what we wanted to do and what we wanted to accomplish, had always planned on being a 3-book series. Somewhere in the middle of book 2, which had grown exponentially, Crave is about 560 pages long, Crush is about 700 pages long, and somewhere in the second book, I was like, we're not going to be able to tell everything we want to tell in 3 books. We need a 4th book. And my editor was reading what I had turned in, and she's like, you're absolutely right. And so we scheduled a 4th book in the series. Somewhere in the middle of the 4th book, which is actually a 900 and some page book, we cut 65,000 words out of it and said, this is actually still really important to the characters' arcs and the story arc, and we're going to need another book. And that's kind of how the series evolved into this 6-book series that it is. So I think that when you're planning a series, I think it's always good to have an idea going in, and if that's your question, have an idea going in what you want to do with it, where you want it to go. I think that sometimes it fits perfectly and you plan perfectly and it just really works the way it should. And I think sometimes you have to be flexible and be willing to grow. Obviously, you need, things like a publishing house and an editor and fans behind you to kind of, be able to justify that. I've been very, very blessed all the way along with all of those things. And so I think you have to be willing to pivot as well. You can't be locked in. You have to.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna just leave it there. You have to plan.
That was great. You definitely have to be open to where the story wants to go as well, and also the market and what publishers have to say and all of that stuff. Kathleen.
I loved what Tracy said about we're going to need a bigger book. I was thinking about the Jaws movie. We're going to need a bigger boat. Because when I pitched the dime, I didn't know whether it was going to be a series, but once I outlined the arc and talking to the publisher and the editor, he said, there is so much here that we can extend it out. And it was a different writing process for me, because the first 3 books, I was more of an organic kind of, the first book I had a beginning, middle, and an end. The second and third books were a little bit more kind of open-ended. I wasn't really sure until I was sure where the story was going to go. But for me, what worked better in the series was having milestones already plotted out like a track for a train to follow, because some things, putting in Easter eggs, little hints of things that may not show up until the second or the third book. And also just in the process of developing a character, and you bring in other ancillary characters, that allows for world building and expansion of the basic narrative. So it was a new experience for me. I mean, Tracy, you've kind of gone into this. You're much more experienced in this. For me, it was a steep learning curve, because I had to keep thinking ahead, like playing 3-dimensional chess in a way. If I do this, can I leave it open-ended, maybe to finish it in the second or the third book, which is what happened. It was a challenge, but it was really satisfying. And we were talking earlier, Tracy, about you really fall in love with your characters in a series, and it allows you to develop them in terms of their past, in terms of their, experientially going forward. So I really enjoyed that part of it.
But, I think it's really interesting when you're talking about developing these characters, right? Because it's almost a double-edged sword. You create these characters, and God willing, you fall in love with them and you suffer with them and all of the things that go on. But you have to be very careful, right? You have to not fall into the pitfall of, oh, I don't want to hurt these characters too much, or oh, I'm just doing this to torture them, not because it doesn't move the story forward, or not because it moves the story forward, those kind of things. And so I do think that, especially as I loved what you said about the milestones, right? Like, I think we knew in book one where we wanted to go, right? I was very clear about where I wanted it to end for Grace, who was my main character, and where I wanted to end for her in the love interest, because there's really two arcs. And I think when you do a series, it's very important, right, that you have enough to keep it going. So Grace had a very, very long arc, but the story itself had a long arc as well. And so keeping in mind what the milestones were for Grace, what they were for the story, and then as we add, I love what you said about the ancillary characters, right? As you add other characters that become more important to the story,
right?
One of the things that I've worked really hard to do is to give them arcs as well. So that all of the characters, whether it's just the love interest, obviously had a big growth arc. The secondary love interest had a big growth arc, but so did the best friend. So did, the goofy guy, so that they all had something to learn in each book. They all had something to contribute to the overall story, so that nothing, I hope, the goal is nothing feels superfluous, right? Everything is in there for a reason. Right. Everything is there. And when you get to the end, you're like, oh, right, there it was, way back on page 157 of, the second book. That's where she put it, So I do think those milestones and those touchstones are super important.
Yeah, and what you said, I mean, I had my my high school biology teacher used to say there's nothing superfluous in nature. And I think that's true in a book, that there should be nothing superfluous, either plot line or characters. And I was just curious to know if you had a secondary character that as you developed that within the story, became a much more important focal point for you as the writer and for your main character.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things. I had a very secondary character in the first book that nobody was expecting to become the love interest of the entire series. So that totally flipped on them mid-series. Nobody, they actually thought he was the villain of the series, and nobody was expecting that. I think certainly in the first book in Crave. So there was that. That was of course planned. There was a character I introduced in the third book, Covet, by the name of Remy. And the second I wrote him, I fell in love with him. I was like, I want to know more about this character. I want him to, he just kind of leapt off the page for me, and what I love in a character. And I just thought, this is this guy that, I want to do more with him. And I did more with him in the series, I think, than I originally planned. But he is actually the hero of the spin-off series. So he totally came alive for me. And then a character in the fourth book, the second that I put her on the page, I was like, oh, there's his heroine. I found her. She's right here. And so that happened to me twice in the series.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you both so much. I love what you're saying about the plotting that you're doing and all of that good stuff. And we're going to come back to so much of this as we really dive into like planning a series and what that takes. For a second, I just want to address like the audio issues that people are mentioning in the chat box. So moving forward, if you're not speaking, just mute yourselves just so that we can limit that echo that folks are talking about. But yeah, thank you so much. I think your answers have been amazing. So yeah, as we set out to really dive into the planning part of writing a series, there are a couple of questions from the Google form that registrants had access to submit questions into that I want to address at the start. I think because they really are about what you can or can't do with the series. And so I just want to talk about those, get those questions answered and out of the way, and then we can dive into your process for the planning. So just to start, one of the questions that we got was, is it essential that a series contain the same main character or cast of characters? Similarly, what if each book has a similar world or theme? So if Kathleen, if you'd like to take a start with just that question.
Sure. I had the same main character, Betty Rizek, through all 3 books. But we had a joke that my agent at the time, when she really liked a character, she would call me up and she'd say, "You're going to kill him, aren't you?" And, and sometimes strategically for emotional impact, or just because it made sense to the story, that character, because it's crime, and she's a narcotic detective on the mean streets of Dallas, and so I had to address a certain amount of violence that came along with the story. And so certain characters, there were a few characters that made the journey with Betty through all 3 books. And they were very important to her stability and emotional health. But there were other characters that dropped out after the first book. And then I introduced new ones in the second, and a few fell away in the second. And then I added even more new characters. And with each addition of a new character or characters, I had the opportunity to expand Betty's, the substance of who and what Betty was. So that was a really wonderful exercise in terms of developing her character.
Great, thank you. Yeah. And in terms of like having the same main character, cast of characters, like your books are wonderful for that exploration of one character and how they grow and face challenges. And that is a lot of fun to read. Tracy, any thoughts on the same main character, cast of characters?
Well, I think it really depends on what you're writing. You know what I mean? I think that if you are writing and like a crime series, such as what Kathleen's writing, where you have this detective. I mean, there are obviously many crime series that kind of do the same thing, right? But they follow this detective. It's a very successful model for a series. I think in young adult, they tend to build them in trilogies, like we talked about earlier, and they tend to follow a group of characters. They might have spin-offs. They might have standalone novels of other characters as well. But I had noticed right before we started, I had looked at the Q&A, and there was somebody in there who had a question, kind of the same thing about building a series. I think it was about a 12-year-old boys, but different ones in different situations. And absolutely, they really do tend to do that, particularly in middle grade, when you're building series like I Survived, or a series about somebody famous or something like that. Or like the I Survived series it teaches you about a historical incident in time, and they create a different character for it. So you're really following the series for what it does versus the series for that one character. Romance, for example, tends to, they do it different ways. One, you can follow one character through 3, 4, sometimes even more books, or one couple as things happen. Other times you can follow different couples that are intertwined in the same friend group, family, whatever, through the series. Or some of the really successful series that I've been seeing, in the more recent years, they tend to just create the world and put all these different characters and couples in this world to play, and they may not even know each other, but they're all existing in this world. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to build a series today. I don't know that there's any specific right or wrong answer at this point. I think that you've got to do what feels right for you, and then you've got to, well, depends, right? If you're going to self-publish or if you're going to get a publisher, get a publisher and an editor that's behind you with whatever it is that you're wanting to do.
Yeah, thank you. So now I want to get into the actual planning of your series. So I'm wondering, like, you're writing this first book and you've you know now that you want there to be more books. So I'm wondering, like, how did you begin planning your series? Did you do outlines for all of the books? Kathleen, you already mentioned the milestones. So if you could dive into that a little bit more, and also just like on how you started planning it, do you have any organizational tips for writers who are getting ready to take on the series that they might need to be thinking about at the very start, so it's not that much harder down the line? And Kathleen, I can start with you.
Oh, okay. I've taught a class several times for Writers League about making the transition from historical fiction to contemporary crime. And what worked for me, I got a very good piece of advice from a veteran crime writer who said, pacing is so important in crime fiction. You know, historical fiction, at least my experience of writing historical fiction, is that there's more tolerance, perhaps, or allowance for the slow burn, a building, you know, a slow building of the world, whereas the pacing for contemporary crime is very fast paced. The sentence structure is different. The impact, the emotional impact has got to come fast and furious. And so his piece of advice to me was, at some point early on, write your ending so that you know, and I knew pretty early on that there was going to be at least one more book. So I knew that there was going to be an open end to the ending, but I wrote the ending pretty early on. And that was very helpful to me because it allowed me to, you know, just sometimes I have a tendency with doing research, I get kind of lost in the weeds. And this kept me on a more defined plot line. It streamlined the process for me. It doesn't work for everybody that way. I know some authors who write contemporary crime series and they pants, you know, they write on the seat of their pants. Everything is sort of like a surprise to them as well as the reader. But for me, that's what worked. And I kept notes while I was writing the first. When I would get an idea of planting an Easter egg, I would make notes then for the second book to then answer that question or that mystery at a certain point. So I was working forward, and it is, you know, I mentioned three-dimensional chess, but there is a certain amount of strategy to it because you don't want to box yourself into a corner. You want to keep your options kind of open. At least I found that. So that's what helped me, is to constantly keep notes for ideas for the next and the next and the next, and keeping that ending open-ended. So that's what worked for me.
Thank you so much. Tracy?
I always loved the idea of being a pantser. Like, I just think it's so romantic. You just sit down and you write your story and it pours out of you. And I think early in my career, I was very much like that. I think that as you write series, as you write complicated series, I think it becomes harder and harder to do that and do it well for the reader, right? Because yeah, Easter eggs and plot points in book 1 that are going to come into fruition in book 5 or whatever else, it becomes very hard to do that if you're pantsing, you know what I mean? Because I need to know, yeah, where the story is going to end, but I need to know, like we said, those milestones all the way along the way. So I know, okay, if this is the mythology and this is what's going to happen to Grace, and I want this to not come out of left field for my readers, I want them, when they reread the series, to go back when they're reading it in book 1, say, oh my God, there it was. Mm-hmm. There it was right there. She's a gargoyle. There it is. Right. And there it is right here. And there it is over here. And oh my God, this whole thing about whatever this subplot is and that subplot. So not only do I know the big arcing, you know, where we're going to go, I tend to really work out the subplots as well. Like, hey, it starts here, it's going to end here. Now, where it kind of goes in the middle could be a surprise for me, because I don't want it to be all planned out, because then that's no fun. Right. You know, I love sitting down and being nothing makes me happier, I think, as a writer. Then when I get to a scene, it just happened to me today, in fact, this morning around 7 a.m. I was writing, and I had this whole scene, like I've been thinking about it all night, and I knew where it was going to go, and I'm writing it, and it took, like, it didn't just take a left turn, like it just like it just went off the highway. It went so far from where I thought it was going to go that I was like, well, that's interesting. And I actually am really happy about it. I think I'm going to keep it this way. I don't think I'm going to rewrite it. But it was very much not what I was expecting. And I think you have to, it goes back to that being open, right? To when the muse or when genius or whatever you want to call it strikes, and you're like, oh my God, that's great. That's how it goes. But also about being very, very strict with yourself about not being lazy about things. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that I think has saved me, because in this series, I have so many characters, and this world has so many moving parts and different pieces, like the vampire court and the dragon court and the giant city and the wolf court, like all of these different things that I had to keep a Bible. I mean, I had to. And I think the more detailed your Bible is, the better off you'll be. I have like characters' names. I have what they look like, what color their eyes are, if they have, an accent, what their like fatal flaw is, what their, good points are. I have any major things that, like, if I've said it in book 2 and it like might come up or I might contradict it in book 4, I try to put all of that down too, because like I said, when you're a million words in, and things have been cut, you're not necessarily like remembering exactly everything that you've written about a very side character, for example. But you break the world if you mess that up, and you don't want to do that, because then you pull your reader out of the experience, and it ruins it for them. And I think your fans, especially if you're writing a series, your fans are sticking with you, and they're amazing and they're wonderful and they're so supportive, and the last thing you want to do is ruin their reading experience because you made a mistake, because you were you forgot, because you wrote it 4 years ago, and you're really thinking, yeah, I remember everything about Grace, and I remember everything about Hudson and Jackson and whatever, but I don't really remember what color Delilah's eyes are. But if your fan has read that book 10 times, they remember very well. And you don't want to mess that up either.
Right. Very good point. Very good point. And I love what you said about, waking up this morning and the storyline went in an unexpected direction. I mean, that's the magic. That's when the magic happens, right? When you just, when you have that moment of playfulness or unexpected surprise that your characters, it's from you, but it feels like it's from them. It's kind of a surprising revelation. And that's one of the best things about the writing process, are those moments of magic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love what you all are saying. And I think there's like a really key takeaway here, and it's that, yes, you have to be organized. Yes, you want to plan ahead, but at the end of the day, you have to be open to the story and where it wants to go, and to surprises. And they say this all the time, like, no surprise for the reader, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And that is absolutely where the magic happens. So I want to take a moment to really dive into the first book of the series and what it has to accomplish, because the first book is really important for a lot of reasons. And so I'm wondering, what do you think your first book needed to accomplish to ensure that you had not only just like enough to keep going with the story, but also that your readers wanted to keep reading about this world or these characters? And Kathleen, I'll start with you.
Well, it kind of felt like, because I wasn't sure, this was such a departure for me. And my first attempt at it, I got 90 pages in, and the agent, took it and read it. And she called me up and she said, this, you're trying to be Dennis Lehane. We already have a Dennis Lehane. It's not in the pocket. It's not where it needs to be. And so that was a defining moment for me, because I hit the delete button and erased everything that I'd been working on, because I realized that she was right. Intuitively, I felt she was right. And I started from scratch. So it took me a while to develop this new character, I go into writing a book, giving my lead character or characters as much headwind as possible from the get-go. So, the Outcasts, my female protagonist, was a prostitute in 1870, abandoned to an orphanage, and who had epilepsy, just right off the bat. Betty Rizek, she's in Dallas. She's 6 feet tall. She's got bright red hair, and she's a lesbian in the Dallas Police Department. So from the very get-go, I started developing a character that I knew was going to have to fight for every inch of ground. Any beachhead she was able to advance upon, she was going to have to fight for it. Because for me, just personally, it just makes it more interesting in developing the character. But I would say that writing the first book, The Dime, establishing the main character and where she came from, because each of the 3 books, I do a flashback of her beginning years in New York as a young cop. She comes from a corrupt background. Her father was corrupt. Her brother was corrupt. And she has a very special relationship with her Uncle Benny, who was the good guy. He was the good cop. He speaks to her through all 3 books, even though he's dead. So I love, in almost every book, I have just a glimmer, a touch of the unexplainable, a touch of the supernatural. Does he speak to her? Is he really a spirit, or is it just her conscience inside her head? So, but it felt to me almost like a sprint versus the second and third books, which felt like a relay. I sort of felt like I had to get my sea legs writing the first book. It was a totally new genre for me. And the idea of writing a series was something that I kind of had to learn as I went along, and it worked out really well. And I grew to love Betty and all of her, her colleagues. And one of the most interesting things in doing the research was talking to the retired detectives here, men and women, who gave me some amazing stories that I was able to fold into the book. So it was a steep learning curve.
It's a hard thing to do. Tracy.
When we're talking about, the question is, what do we think we need to do in the first book to really set the groundwork for the series to make it something that readers continue with? I think that really depends on the kind of book you're writing, because I think every series has things that its readers expect. Every genre has things that its readers expect. When I go into writing a series, like for YA, for example, a YA paranormal series, when I go into it, I go in wanting to build a world that my readers want to stay in. Right? You need to build a compelling world, a world that excites them, a world that catches their imagination, whatever it is. And I think that's true anytime you're writing a series, whether you're writing small town romance, or I did a snowboarding series at one time, or if you're writing, an urban fantasy series. I don't think it matters. I think that the world has to be fun. It has to be compelling. It has to be interesting. And as you go through the series, it has to continually surprise your readers. You don't ever want them to feel like, oh, I know everything about this world. You want them to, be excited to learn something new, or to think about it, or to, be thinking about it when they're walking down the street versus just while they've got your book in front of them. I think building that world is super important. I think it's also very important for you as a writer, because it's so much more fun to write in a world like that, right? A world that you want to be a part of, a world that's exciting to you. So I think that's part of it. I think the second thing you have to do, especially if you're building a series based on one character, you have to make that character compelling. The character has to be somebody that readers will get behind and really like. She can't, or he can't just be, they can't be a really perfect character that doesn't have a lot of flaws. They can't be a character that is so flawed that you think, oh my gosh, I'm just not interested in this person. They're just making so many mistakes. I just don't care about them, right? You have to strike that balance between those those two things for your character, so that they have a lot of room for growth through the series, but that your fans and your readers have they root for them. They have an attachment to them. They want to see them do well, and they hurt when they don't, I thought it was so funny when Kathleen was saying that her agent was like, "Oh, I love this character. That means you're going to kill them, right?" I kill wantonly and with glee, particularly in the Crave series. I also do some things that make me sob, and I figure like in Covet particularly, as I was writing the last 150, maybe 200 pages of Covet, I had turned it over to my agent, who was, inconsolable when I called her to say, because I knew she was reading it. And I turned my editor, and my editor swore at me and told, threw the phone across the room and said, "I'm not talking to you ever again." And I was like, okay, that's kind of how I felt. So, okay, so that's good. I did what I needed to do here. Because I think that you can't be afraid. You can't be afraid to kill a character. There's a character in book 4 that I killed that I didn't want to kill. Like, I did not want to kill that character, but everything had built to the point where that character had to die, and I was distraught about it as a writer, and I hoped that translates in your books as well to your readers, right? You have to give them characters that they attach to, because and it doesn't, not just your main character, because again, a series rests on your main character, but a series doesn't rest only on your main character. The series rests on the world that you create. It rests on all of the side characters that you create, so that everybody kind of has their favorite, right? Like, there's your main character, but then there's like, oh, I like Flint, or I like Macy, or I like, Gwen, or I like Eden, or whatever, whoever it is. And so you have to make those characters real, and you have to make those characters come alive, and you have to do it early, and you have to continue it so that they feel like real people too, And then the other thing I think you really have to be clear about in a series is, I think you need to know what the central idea of each book is, but I think you also need to know what the central idea of the story is. What are the themes that you want to move through these books? What are the statements you want to make that you want when your reader gets to book 4 for them to say, okay, I really understand that this is what Tracy believes about life. And this is what Tracy believes about friendship. This is what Tracy believes about female strength. This is what Tracy believes about good and evil. If they can't do that, if they can't see that by the time they get to, book 4 or whatever, then I feel like you've done something wrong. You need to tie that in, and you need to start the roots of that very early in book 1. I have a friend who says, you never introduce anything new in a book past page, I think it's 75, she says. All the groundwork for whatever's going to happen. It could be a lot of new plot stuff, a lot of new exciting things, but all of the groundwork for what's going to happen is already in there in the first 75 pages of the book. And I feel in a lot of ways, the groundwork of what that central idea is, of where those characters are going to go, all of that, the roots are in that first book. Now, you may introduce a character in book 3. Obviously, the roots won't be in that first book, but that main, whatever you're starting with, those roots need to be there. Because if they aren't, I just feel like that's where you start worrying about things like sagging middles, and that's where you start worrying about running out of things to do with these characters and this world you've created.
And by extension, what you said is so important, Tracy, thematically, because there's the plot, which is the progression of the narrative, but then there's thematically what it is you're trying to say, your point of view in the world that you're building. And so, I kind of was glib about, getting rid of characters, but it can be in service to the thematically to what you're trying to say. So if I allowed one of her colleagues, Betty's colleagues, to be killed, it was an example of him. It was an example of courage and self-sacrifice that he met his end, but it portrayed thematically something greater, like courage and self-sacrifice. So I think, like you said, everything needs to be in service thematically as well as to the plot, I think.
Yes, definitely. So we had a ton of questions about structure in the Google form. And so I am really wondering like how you each approach the structure. So a lot of the questions wondered about whether the books altogether create one overarching structure, if you think about the books individually as having like their own structures that turn into a bigger one, or if all of the books should be able to stand alone. So how did you approach structuring individual books, but also the structure of the entire series? And Kathleen, I will stick with you.
So I think it's really important for me, it was really important in the overall, the grand structure of the book, that my character Betty, who comes from a corrupt cop family, that one of her, the fundamental driving force was that she cannot and will not allow herself to be corrupted in the way her parents were. So that was sort of the jewel in the crown, if you will. And in terms of, fortunately or unfortunately, there was never a dearth of subject matter because crimes are always being committed. I mean, she's a narcotics detective. So there were constantly things that I could put into the plot, but again, her interaction with that, and not that she wasn't tempted, or not that she hadn't been, people didn't try to bribe her or blackmail her. But that was sort of in the grand scheme. And then I kind of plotted out, I had the beginning and I had pretty much an idea for an end. And then I could storyboard. And the way I work is that I like to work on 3x5 cards, and each chapter will be thematically, and I'll lay it out like a quilt almost. And sometimes I'll juggle these things around to more interesting, to jump forward or backward in time. But for me, it helped anchor me in the story. And then of course, things always change. Like Tracy was saying, that you have an idea for, maybe you've plotted out what's going to happen in this chapter. And something better occurs to you, or something different, or new possibilities. What helps me keep the story fresh is constant research, and being very, like Tracy said, keeping a Bible on your characters, filled with minutia, the grand vision, but also the little tiny quirks, the little foibles. What made Indiana Jones so great, the hero so great, was because he was brave, but he was terrified of spiders and snakes. I mean, that one little picadillo added so much affection for that character. So all of these things are important. Plotting for me, that's the way I do it. I plot out each chapter and then I play with it as I work ahead.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Okay.
Tracy is working, I think, on getting some headphones set up, so
okay.
Maybe help out with the audio a little bit. But yeah, so I'm curious. I'll stick with you, Kathleen, until he comes back. But yeah, I'm curious, so did you run into any dead ends or plot holes as you were working on the series, coming into book 2 and book 3? How did you navigate that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. So the first book, I finished the first book and started on the second book and finished the entire manuscript, turned it into the editor, and the editor said, the first half of this is fantastic, But the second half, I had taken it out to West Texas, and he said, it's not working. It's lost a lot of its sizzle. So I had to, after talking to him about it, I agreed again that he was right. So I uncoupled the second half, put that aside, and rewrote the second half completely differently. And it was better. It really was better. So I think being open to, I think you're always going to run into dead ends. I think there are going to be times when you're working on a plot line or a character and it's just not working. And you have to make the courage to disconnect yourself from that and start over again if it's not working. No way around it.
Thank you. Tracy, you're back. Thank you.
I am.
Awesome. Oh yeah, the audio sounds much better. Thank you for grabbing.
I got a brand new computer and this was the first time I've used it for anything. And apparently it is, I need to go back to my old one for Zoom. So I apologize.
That is all right. So we left off asking about structuring individual books, structuring the series as a whole. Can you talk about your process structuring Crave?
Structuring Crave, just the book, not the series?
I mean, you can talk about the book individually, but also the series as a whole. Both.
Okay, so structuring the Crave series. I heard you ask Kathleen about plot holes.
I will come back to that for you. Well, you can answer that as the second part to the question.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I think I really talked about how I structured the series, right? Like I looked at the beginning, I looked at where I wanted the main character to go. I looked at what themes I wanted to pull through the story. I looked at what kind of world I wanted to build. And I kind of just really worked on doing all of that at the beginning. And then it's one of those things that you don't just say, okay, I've done this once and I don't need to do it again. It's something that I revisit every time I write a book. It's something I revisit several times during the writing of that book. I make sure that what I'm doing is true to where I want to go. I make sure, Kathleen had said earlier that, there's nothing superfluous, right? I write these really big books because they're big plots and they're big character arcs, or at least I think they are, right? Big plots, big character arcs, big world building, and when you do that, you end up with I think just a heavy book. But I also go through and I think there's a lot of ideas that don't make the cut. There's a lot of things that I pull out. There's a lot of things then that my editor has pulled out through time, saying, oh no, as editors do, this doesn't work. This doesn't really serve the story. This is you just, loving, the old expression, right? Don't kill your darlings. Like, oh my gosh, I just wrote the prettiest sentence ever. And yeah, maybe that scene doesn't work, but I love that sentence so much. I want to keep it in. Yeah, no. Off the scene goes, out goes the sentence, and you just get to cry and kind of move on about it, And so I think you just have to really keep that in mind all the way through the series. Am I being true to what my vision of the series is? Am I being true to who these characters are? Yes, they are evolving. Grace in book 4 is not Grace in book 1, and she shouldn't be. She's been through a lot. She's changed a lot. She's been on her own a lot more than she ever was, at the beginning of Crave. So all of that has gone through, or all of that she's gone through, and all of that I have to keep in mind. But I also just kind of have to keep in mind, like, again, just where I want to be at the end. And it needs to be logical. It needs to be reasonable. And the fans need to have, the goal, right? The goal is that they don't see it coming the first read, but the second read, they're like, oh, of course, there it was. You don't want them to feel like, well, that was the stupidest thing I ever, why did she do that? That was never work. Grace would never have done that. Because then you failed as a writer. You've taken a wrong turn. You've done something that you shouldn't have. I had one series that I wrote. It was actually my very first YA trilogy. It was the Tempest Rising trilogy. It was a mermaid story. And I had a plan, like I knew where this was going. And a lot of it was like wrapped up in her relationship with her mother and all of these things. And that was another one of those scenes that like, went off the highway. I'm writing it one day in book one. I had major plans in book three for Tempest and her mom. I'm writing it in book one, and I write this scene and I murder her mother. And I was like, what just happened? Like, I don't understand how that happened. Like I literally got up from the keyboard. I was so stressed out, and I walked away. I did laundry. I took a walk, and then like, I didn't come back for 2 days because I had just, blown like my entire series to hell. And then I decided that was actually the way that it needed to go. And that is actually how the series and the first book and the rest of the series went to print. But yeah, I think you have to be true to what your vision is and keep your characters true and check yourself regularly to make sure that you're not going off the rails.
Mhm.
Yes, thank you so much. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about readers, keeping them entertained because readers definitely, they don't want to read the same story over and over again. So we've already talked a lot about, your characters need to be able to grow and stuff like that. But I'm wondering, when you're writing a series, especially like books 2, 3, 4, 5, however far you go, there's the assumption that your readers have read the previous books. But how closely have they read them? What do they remember? We don't know. So how do you balance refreshing a reader's mind about important plot points from previous books without it feeling too repetitive, or so that it's not just this big like info dump, like remember when this happened? So Tracy, I can start with you.
I think, yeah, again, that's a delicate line, right? Because you don't want to, nobody wants an info dump. Nobody wants to be overwhelmed. Everybody wants to start with action. And so I think it really is about looking at those first 3 to 5 chapters. Well, it depends on how many chapters in your book. My chapters tend to run really, really short. My chapters are between 3 and 6 pages at the most. So for somebody who's got 20-page chapters, that might be a very different story. But for me, it's the first 3 to 5 chapters. And in those 3 to 5 chapters, kind of finding moments, right, where I can weave in 2 to 3 sentences. No, probably no more than that at any given time. Usually more like 2, to remind people of where we left off and what happens and why it is the way it is and why this is going on. And I do that. I mean, it depends on how much, baggage there was at the end of the last book. Like how far in the future am I leaping? I have one book in the series that picks up 4 months later. I have one book in the series that picks up 5 minutes later, and it really I think that too depends on how much you weave in. 4 months, a lot has happened, and you have more time to kind of go back and say, hey, this is what went on, and this is where my characters were, and this is why their emotional state, scene and sequel, right? Why their emotional state is different here. Well, they've gone through 4 months that you haven't seen versus, wow, this just happened. And now, it's been 6 months since the book came out, but I'm picking right back up 5 minutes later. And I need to clue you in fast as to why they're here. If you don't remember, because you read the book 6 months ago and you have no idea that this terrible thing just happened, here I have to remind you, but I have to do it quickly, and I have to do it in a way that is conducive to the series or conducive to the beginning, so it doesn't drag it down and make you be like, you know what, I don't want to read that. It's a balance. I think it's all a balancing act in a series, to be honest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I think Tracy's absolutely right about keeping it succinct. I wrote The Dime, The Burn, and The Pledge so that you could read each one of those as a standalone, and referencing what came before. Each book has its own galaxy of characters. It has its own separate story. There are some characters, menacing characters, that are kind of in the background, and then there's the grand climax in the third book. But I tried to keep reference for continuity's sake of what happened in the previous book, either in dialogue, somebody refers to something and it's kind of expressed in dialogue between Betty and one of her colleagues, or in a flashback, but keep it as brief as possible because you don't want to bog down the news story. And sometimes it's been really helpful to have an editor. I had the same editor for the first 3 historical fiction books, and then an editor who was very experienced with contemporary crime. And he was a very in tune, critical reader to balance that. So it was very helpful to have an editor who could help me navigate that. But again, each of the books, you could read each of the books as a standalone and not feel lost.
That's great. Thank you. So Tracy, what you were saying earlier about it depending on where you left off with the last book and those endings. We've already talked about what an opening or a first book has to accomplish. And now I want to talk about what an ending has to accomplish in a series, whether it's, from book 1 to book 2 to like the actual ending of your series. But I'm really wondering, my main question is, what do endings of the book in a series need to accomplish so that your readers want to pick up the next book? Because sometimes they're coming out years later. So how do you keep that momentum going? And also, I think especially for you, Tracy, in the YA world, what can you do in between books to make sure that readers are still thinking about your books? And I'll start with you, Tracy.
Well, I think one of the things that I do that I think my readers have a love-hate relationship with is I give really, really massive cliffhangers at the end of every book. It's the worst thing you have to know the answer to, that is going to be what's at the end of the book. And I think that is a big thing that keeps them thinking about the book. It keeps me excited about the book because I want to answer that question, because I go from writing it into a couple weeks break into then, planning and plotting and doing the next book. And when you're doing a series and they're big books, and you're doing it quickly. I've had the 4 Crave books come out. The first 4, the first book came out 2 years ago last month. And by that time, I'd already had 4 books in the series out by the time the 2-year anniversary came out. So I think it keeps me excited. I think it keeps the reader excited, having an unanswered question that they really, really want to know moving into the next book. I think that's one of the things that you do with the series. I think, what is the last book in a series? That was the beginning part of this question, right? What is the last? Everything. I mean, it has to do everything. Because if you've built up all of these things, you've built up these like 6, 7, depending on how many themes you have running through the series, 6, 7, 10 themes, right? You've developed all of these characters and their arc is coming to an end. And if you have, I love ensemble casts. I've actually given a class to Writers League about ensemble casts. And if you have a cast of 8, which is what I usually have, it's got to be satisfying for all 8 of them. They've all have to complete their arc. I have to tie up all the themes. I have to tie up all the plot. And if you have plot that starts in book 1 that doesn't get tied up to book 4, but plot that starts in book 2 that doesn't get tied to book 4 or book 6, plot in book 3 that doesn't get tied to book 6, you have to carry all that through, and you have to not break your world, right? I am a master of my editor and I laugh. She's like, why did you do this? And I'm like, because it needed to be done. She's like, well, how did it work in your world? I'm like, magic. She's like, magic is not an answer. And I'm like, there are witches. I don't know how magic could not be an answer. She's like, magic is never the answer. Go back and figure out why this happened and come back and talk to me. And but that's no fun. It happened because it was magic. She's like, yeah, now your world is broken. Fix this. And so you have to, you have to beware, you can't, certainly not in the last book, but I think never, but you can't take the easy way out. And then the other thing I want to say is Allie Carter, who is a younger YA author. Like she writes for younger YA, I write for older YA. We've met several times, and one time we were talking, she had a couple of really successful series, and she told me, whether you're doing a spinoff, whether you have another book coming in the series, don't save anything for it. You put everything you have on the table in that book. Every great idea, every brilliant thing that you really want to save to the end, you put it in that book, and then you worry about the next really brilliant thing when you get to the next book. And I think that if you really try to do that, and not hold on to something, and sometimes it's hard because you're like, oh my God, that is the perfect finale of the series, and you're like, oh my God, but it would work really well here too. How would I? And say, nope, I'm going to have to let that. That's a future Tracy problem. This is a now Tracy problem, and I need to make sure that this book gives my readers the satisfaction that they deserve. So never leave anything on the table, never hold anything back. Always give every book the best possible idea that you've got.
Thank you. That's great advice. Kathleen?
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I think that's the creative fire thrives or burns brightly with risk taking. And sometimes it's a risk, like Tracy said, because there's a tendency to think, because we're human and because we're finite, we tend to think, I'll never have this great idea ever again. And so I understand the temptation to, like Tracy said, to have this amazing idea for a beginning, middle, or an end, to save it. But I think she's absolutely right. Spend it all, just put it all out there, and trust that when the next book comes along, there will be something else wonderful and imaginative. And it's not that it'll be better than or less than, it will be exactly what you need for that book that you're working on next. But
and I can I just jump in and say one thing there?
Sure.
Because that's super, because that's everything else. If you do the book before right, then it will be there for you in the next book.
I agree.
If you don't, then there's those pitfalls, those like you fall in and you're like, oh man, didn't see that coming. If you do the book before and the books before right, then when you get there, that idea, that thing that you need is going to be there, and it will have been perfect, and it will be exactly what was meant for that. Okay, back to you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I agree. I think that's totally right. And I think it's a good philosophy for life. Just give it all every day, whatever you've got. And creatively, there is a lot of risk taking. I wrote 3 works of historical fiction that did really well. And then I write this short story, and the editor kind of threw out a challenge. It's like, oh, I think there's something here, novel length. And it felt like I was jumping off of a cliff in a way, because I didn't feel comfortable yet in that genre. I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I could measure up, but I took the plunge. I jumped off the cliff, and there was a period of adjustment that was painful. A lot of hours spent banging my head against the keyboard thinking, I've made a huge mistake. But there are more similarities in the writing process, no matter what the genre is, whether it's historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, romance. A good story is still a good story. And you have to have substantive, compelling characters. Now, the pacing and the world building may be a little bit different strategically, but if you have a really good story and you've got characters that people will really care for and cry over and cheer for, it will all work out. I think it takes time, and it takes as long as it takes. I'm a very slow writer, very slow. So it took me a couple of years to finish the dime where I felt it was fully cooked. And then after that, the second and the third book came easier, because I felt like I had a firm footing from which to build. Mm-hmm. So
I think there is real power in taking risks and stepping outside of your comfort zone. I love paranormal stories, paranormal YA, paranormal romance. It's always kind of been one of my favorite things. I had always kind of stayed away from vampires because I was a little scared of them,
No.
because you're standing on the shoulders of giants. You're standing, there are really brilliant vampire writers who have come before me, and nobody wants to go out there and fall flat on their face
Right.
doing something in a genre that they love, right? And so I was always very nervous about doing it until, like I said, my editor came to me and said, "Hey, we want to do this. Would you be interested in writing a vampire novel or a vampire series?" And I was like, I couldn't pass it up because it's that secret thing I'd always wanted in my life. I'd always been too scared to do. And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do it. And I just kind of dove off the cliff and hoped that, and worked really hard because you're so scared, right? When you take that risk and you're so afraid, I think you just like give it everything to just make sure that, okay, like I've read this 8,000 times and it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
Right. Right. Exactly. I think and what you said about standing on the shoulders of giants, my first book was about the Salem witch trials. How many hundreds of books were written? But yet the challenge was finding, it was a unique story. It was based on true events. And it was just my personal spin on it, which made it unique and different. So in terms of you look at vampires or werewolves, you can make it new and original by infusing it with your own life perspective.
Absolutely. Voice. It's one of the things I realized I hadn't talked about at all when we were talking about what you hang a series on and what keeps readers coming back and what really drives. I think voice is so important.
Yeah.
I think you have to find, and different series have different voices, right? Because different characters have different personalities, different voices, but you have to find the voice of that series, how that series needs to be told. And very often that's the fresh spin, right?
Yes.
That's the funny snark. Like for me, it's the funny, snarky sarcasm that goes along with this, poking kind of fun at some of the conventions of the vampire novel, right? And that was the voice I had to find for Grace and for the story. To carry it through. And it's one of the things that I love most about it. But I think you have to find that voice of the series. And it has to be as honest as you've ever been, right? Because if it's not, I mean, maybe you can fool them in a standalone. It's really hard to fool them. And that's a maybe anyway. But it's certainly really hard to fool them 6 books, 8 books, 12 books in.
Right.
If you haven't been authentic, right? Your readers are going to know and they're not going to like it. And that's fair.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you both so much. It is already 9:15, which is crazy to me. This conversation has just flown by. But I want to ask one more question before we get into the Q&A, and we will definitely try to answer as many questions in the Q&A as we can. So for our audience, if you have lingering questions, please add them now. But this is the craft of writing, right? But in our Google form, we did get a lot of questions about the business side of publishing a series. And so I definitely want to end by touching on that. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us a bit about what the publication process looked like for you and kind of what you learned from selling a series. I'm not sure if you pitched a series, but if you did pitch it, like what was that experience like? Do you have any do's and don'ts? And yeah, I will start with you, Tracy.
I think because I've sold so many series, I think we had talked at the very beginning. I think before it even started that probably 2/3 of the books that I've written have been in one kind of series or another, and so I have very different experiences. I think pitching several of them, right? Some they go in and they're like, we're going to do one book and we're going to see how it goes. Like we'll give you like a 2-book contract. Or a 3-book contract. We're going to do one book before we commit to doing a second or a third. Let's kind of see how it goes. And that's where you very often will see a gap between in your series. You're like, why is there such a big gap? It's because they waited all the way through publication. How was it received? Did it go well before they decided that was, let's greenlight the second book. So that's one way that you'll see series done. Another way they'll come in and they'll say, we're going to buy all 3 books of the series. Because it's a trilogy and we're going to do that. And we're going to hope, and we're going to plan on delivering all 3. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes book 2 does very badly and they're like, maybe we're not going to do the book 3. Let's pivot and do something else. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen in the publishing world. Sometimes they come in and they say, okay, you want this to be a long running series. We're going to start with 2 books. Let's see how the 2 books do. Okay, then we'll do 3 and 4, and then okay, 5, 6, 7. I mean, it really depends. I think every publisher has their own way of doing things. I think when you're starting out a brand new series, depending on where you are you mid-list? Are you debut? Are you debut and they're going to give you a shot? Are you debut and they think you're going to go huge? Are you mid-list waiting to break out? Are you already super successful? All of those things play also into how a publisher is going to position a series. So I think you just have to be aware of all those things as you go into it. But I think having a strong, if you're asking like if you're a brand new author trying to sell a series, I think knowing, having 3 books mapped out in your head. They don't have to be perfect. You obviously have the synopsis for the first, and if you're, submitting on partial, submitting on full manuscript, however that goes, also have a really good idea. If they come back and say, okay, if I want to do this series, what would you do for book 2? What would you do for book 3? Don't be 6 months waiting, trying to figure out what that is, because you don't really know, because you kind of left it all on the table in book 1, which you're supposed to do. After you've left it all on the table in book 1, then think about what book 2 looks like, what book 3 looks like, and have an idea of where your character is going to grow and what the plots are going to be of those books.
Right.
If you're trying to sell a series, that's my best.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kathleen.
Well, the publishing world has changed so much in the last 10, 15 years. My first book was published in 2008, and that was just before Amazon, or He Who Shall Not Be Named, started taking over the world and changed, and for good and for ill, that it shifted the landscape. And so there are many more options now for publishing a book, for, self-publishing or small imprints. I think Tracy's right. If you're a new, as yet to be published, or haven't been published in that genre, I think she's right that you need to have 3 books ready, and they don't have to be fully polished and edited, but just so that the publisher who's going to take a risk on taking the books, has a good idea of what they're taking on. I was really fortunate because I was published by Little Brown for the first 3 books. And their sister company, Mulholland, was the one that came to me and said, what about a novel? But still, I had to finish the first book and have a proposal for the second before they bought. So they bought the first 2, The Dime and the Burn, and then they had an option, right of first refusal for the third, which they honored. So it's always different. It's, the publisher is in the business of selling books. And if you're an unknown quantity, you need to bring more product to the table, I think, than if you're an established writer. So I think that's pretty much how it goes.
Thank you. Thank you both. You have just given us so much great advice and so much to think on in terms of writing series. So let's jump right into the Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So first up, okay, so have you ever written a prequel book to your book series? You saw while writing there's the backstory that's worth having its own book. Is that something that either of you have ever done?
Well, I said that the historical fiction novels were standalone, but actually the second book is a prequel to The Heretic's Daughter. But again, it can be read as a standalone. But that's the only time I've written a prequel.
Tracy?
I haven't written a prequel per se. What I am writing at this exact moment is, I mentioned that between the first book and the second book, I jumped 4 months in time in the series because something very specific happened. And I am at this moment, after the 4th book has come out, before the 6th book, which is the final book in the series, comes out, the 5th book is actually the missing 4 months between book 1 and 2. Oh. So that is something a little different that we're doing. But I'm actually really excited about it. I think it answers a bunch of questions that hadn't been answered yet. And I think that it gives me a chance to really play with a relationship that I really like.
Ooh, that's so exciting. I love that relationship.
Oh, yay.
Next question. What do you think the biggest mistake is that authors make when writing a series that causes it to fail? And either of you feel free to jump in.
Well, Tracy, you have much more experience in writing series and different kinds of series. So I'm going to turn that to you.
I don't know. One of the things we had talked about actually at the very beginning is this fear of staying too long in a series, right? Mm-hmm. You want to go, this is my own personal opinion. I want to go out when the going is good, when everybody is happy with the series and they're like, yes, she's done this is good. I don't want to be the series that stays too long at the party that nobody wants anymore and is like, yeah, you still have your core base, but even they're like, she just doesn't have the same magic she once had. So I think that one of the things that people do is they overstay at a successful series until it's no longer successful. And I think that the way to avoid that is to always be honest with yourself. Don't let your ego get ahead of yourself. Always, I'm pretty brutally honest, I think, with myself. Be honest with yourself. Have people around you that can tell you, hey, look, I feel like it's done. And that's like your agent and that's, your editor, who's going to be honest, like, yeah, we can still make money off of this, but there's no story here. I think that's one thing, is have people around you that you trust. Other things, I think, and I never really said this about the first book, I think people sometimes overcomplicate the first book. I think in a series, the first book should have the roots of all what's going to come forward. But I think that the actual plot should be the most straightforward because you're introducing them. They have to learn your world. They have to learn your characters. They have to learn all the things that are going on in there. If you throw them a massive, massive, massive plot that they have to try to keep up with all of those extra things, as well as learning all of the world building in and outs, as well as learning all the character in and outs, I think that it can become work. I think some authors can do it fantastically. I'm not saying otherwise. I'm not saying, don't write something complicated. I'm just saying that just be very careful that you're not overwhelming your reader at the beginning, because I think that sometimes we tend to do that, and then readers are like, oh, I'm going to put that down. It's good, but it's hurting my brain, and then they don't come back to it. And then also, I think, yeah, you don't save the good stuff. It's a balance. I keep saying that, but it really is. It's this very delicate balance of leaving it all on the table, but not leaving too much on the table. And then also don't answer everything. Make sure that there are things that make them want to go on to the next book. I mean, you want the first book to be satisfying. You want your character to have completed an arc. You want your plot to have completed as well. But you also want to have questions. Story question drives everything. Story question from the very beginning of any book, right? What is the story question? What is it that I really, really have to have the answer to? I'm going to read 300 pages. I'm going to read 600 pages. I'm going to read 2,000 pages, I think is where we're at now, to get to the answer to that story question. So you have to have that driving force through it. If you lose sight of it, I think that it's harder for your readers to keep up and keep their enthusiasm up for the series.
Great, thank you. In terms of like a series that is failing, maybe I can't stop thinking about, this is a TV show, but Game of Thrones in the last season and how upset people were about that. And it's just like, yeah, absolutely everything that you just said, Tracy. Okay, next question. Can you tell us about your writing schedule? When you have a series, are you expected to produce a manuscript several times a year? And you can both speak to your experiences with your schedules.
I think that depends on every writer, every publisher, every editor. Everything is, I mean, it's just depending. Like Kathleen said, it took her 2 years to really get her first book where she felt this is ready to go out into the world, I think that you have to sometimes have the freedom, and you'll see that stall in schedules, right? A very successful series where something happens in the writer's life or whatever it is. And you're like, man, I can't do this right now. Because writing is one of those things that it's very personal. And if you can't get in there, you can't get in there for whatever reason, you know? But I do think, I mean, it really depends. I think there is conventional wisdom of how you grow a series. I think that as 2008, as Kathleen said, as self-publishing became a thing, publishers realized there are lots of ways to grow a series. And there are ways self-pub authors say, this is what you need to do. You need to have these 5 books. You need to have this, you need to have that. Conventional will be like 1 a year or 2 a year, steady schedule. And I think it's just one of those things. You have to look at what you can produce. How fast of a writer are you? What does your life look like? Are you writing as a second job? Is this your main job? All of those things, you have to be realistic, because you can't, tell your publishing house, barring, an emergency or something terrible happening in your life. When that happened, I'm sorry, I was thinking about the fact that my mother just recently died, and it threw my production schedule. I'm very off. So barring something like that happening, you have to deliver, I mean, right now we're in a pandemic, and it's been very interesting because paper shortages and printer shortages and trying and growing a series in the middle of all of that is incredibly difficult, because you just can't print enough books to have a release day, and things like that have happened as well. So you have to, all of these things are things, and this is why, it's so great to have a publisher, because these are things that they negotiate and they deal with, and I just get to live in my world. But it all of that, not to take up all the time, but all of that is dependent on what you can produce, what your publisher wants, how they think your schedule should work.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. That is all the time that we have for tonight, but I definitely want to encourage everyone who is here to buy these wonderful authors series, buy all the books, read them all. They're all great. You can find that link in the chat box. We did partner with Book People, so you can not only support these authors, but also support an independent bookstore. But that is it for tonight. Thank you both so much. I learned so much about the process and the business side of things, and I am sure that our audience did too. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam. It was wonderful meeting you, Tracy.
It was wonderful meeting you, Kathleen. Thank you so much. I do apologize. Like I said, this is the first Zoom meeting I've done on my new computer, and obviously there is something wrong with it. So I will make sure that's not a problem in the future.
Oh, that was
thank you.
It's okay. Yeah, we're all used to Zoom and Zoom things, so do not worry about it at all.
It's exciting.
Have a good night, y'all.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Good night.